You probably think every Soviet aircraft from that era is already known, filed away in some archive, cataloged by a design bureau somewhere. One airplane proves that isn't true. In the autumn of 1959, a Soviet expedition was working in the empty tundra, 200 kilometers from Norilsk. Geologists were searching for minerals and unexpectedly noticed a metal fragment sticking out of the frozen ground. The group dropped their scheduled work and started digging, even as the frost was closing in, and even though they would have to answer to their superiors for every day they lost. What exactly they found? I'm not going to tell you yet. The main thing in this story isn't in the middle. It's in the very finale. If you think you already know how this expedition ended, you don't. Because what they dug out of the ground with their bare hands made people question not one fact, but the entire timeline of aviation.
I'm going to show you the examination report that was classified at the time, England's refusal to take part in the investigation, and one metal alloy that doesn't exist in any reference book on aviation materials. One by one, the explanations that had seemed obvious the day before fell apart, and the estimated age of the find led investigators to a conclusion that no longer sounded like a scientific report. It sounded like the plot of a banned science fiction novel.
A secret project by an unknown genius, the trace of a lost technology, a machine from the future, or a legend hiding a completely different truth. Stay with this video until the end, because after it, you'll look at the history of aviation differently. Right now, we're going to reconstruct the entire chain of events and get to the most shocking, contradictory, and least obvious details of the airplane that shouldn't have existed. Permafrost covered more than 45% of the territory of the Soviet Union. Nearly half the country was land that never fully thawed, even in summer, where any construction turned into a fight with nature itself. But in Moscow, they didn't look at the northern maps as a warning. They looked at them as a promise. Under that frozen ground could be metals, coal, oil, and other resources a rapidly growing industry desperately needed. On paper, it all sounded simple. Send an expedition, run a survey, put the findings on a map. In reality, scientists and geologists faced hundreds of kilometers without roads, without settlements, without reliable communication. Equipment failed in the cold, fuel had to be shipped in ahead of time, and a single ordinary breakdown could leave people stranded, alone, against the northern wilderness. None of that stopped the state machine. The country needed new industrial regions, and it needed proof that no territory was closed to the Soviet people. Special attention went to Siberia, Yakutia, Chukotka, Kolyma, and Taimyr. Geologists drilled exploratory boreholes. Geophysicists searched for hidden deposits by indirect signs, and topographers refined maps that still had enormous blank spots on them. But behind the loud talk of conquering the North was a far less heroic reality. The leadership wanted plans and reports, and nature had no intention of obeying orders from an office. That's exactly why, in the North, people understood the era's unspoken formula better than anywhere else. If it's needed, it's needed. No argument allowed. If people had to be moved hundreds of kilometers from the nearest city, they were moved. If equipment had to be dragged through waterlogged tundra, it got dragged.
That formula also applied to dozens of so-called assessment expeditions, the ones that didn't discover deposits outright, but only determined whether it was worth continuing the search at all. Their work rarely made front-page news, even though future mines and industrial giants started right there. The costs were enormous. No one guaranteed a result in advance, and the short northern summer always ended before the whole plan could be finished. But stopping the research program would have meant admitting that huge stretches of the country's own territory were simply out of reach. and the Soviet leadership had no intention of admitting anything of the kind. By the late 50s, the pressure was only building. Industry needed raw materials, and every promising site could become a future center of production. Dozens of groups were sent north again and again. What they were expected to bring back was numbers, coordinates, and convincing conclusions, not stories about hardship. One of those expeditions, in the autumn of 1959, ended up 200 kilometers northeast of Norilsk, right where, under the frozen ground, its members were about to find something no state plan had ever accounted for. The group was sent into that region under the leadership of Nikolai Novikov. Their assignment was ordinary for the time: carry out assessment work, determine whether there might be industrial mineral deposits underground. There was nothing in the official brief about searching for lost aircraft, secret installations, or traces of an unknown civilization. Picture the place for a moment. 200 kilometers to the nearest settlement, and only a handful of days left before the short northern summer ran out. The group arrived in autumn, just as the northern landscape was preparing to slam its short window for fieldwork shut. There was almost no vegetation, only a few twisted little trees rising out of the frozen ground and dead grass bending under the cold wind. The landscape itself seemed to be warning them, "You're not staying here long." The expedition had a strict schedule, and it couldn't be stretched indefinitely. What could throw that schedule off? Almost anything. Sudden bad weather, equipment failure, terrain that was hard to cross. Even a small delay here turned into a serious problem because lost time was almost impossible to make up, and leadership expected results, not explanations. It was Novikov who had to decide where to hold up and when to end the work because of the threat of a sudden freeze. Turn back too early, and it would look like caution masking failure. Turn back too late, and both the people and the collected materials would be at risk. So the expedition worked at a punishing pace, surveying the surface, noting the terrain's features, looking for any sign of exposed rock that might point to hidden resources underground. From the outside, none of it looked like an adventure, just repetitive measurements, soil samples, coordinates, notes. But it was exactly that attention to detail that soon stopped the specialists in their tracks, in front of an object that had nothing to do with geology at all. During the expedition, the researchers made an unexpected discovery. In one section, a metal fragment stuck out of the frozen ground, clearly not a rock, and clearly not part of any geological equipment. It sat at an angle and ran deep into the soil, so its size was impossible to judge at first glance. Who left a massive object like this out here, 200 kilometers from Norilsk? And why? The find looked especially strange because of just how empty this region was. There was no road nearby, no abandoned settlement, no industrial site a piece of heavy metal equipment could have come from. There was no record of any construction or military work ever taking place here. Something was sticking out of the tundra that seemed to have no place on any map at all. They could have walked past it. Novikov's group was searching for minerals, not investigating the origin of abandoned machinery. And any unplanned object was eating into time they didn't have to spare. But leaving the fragment unexamined meant potentially losing a find whose true nature might be impossible to determine by the time anyone came back in spring. As long as only a small part of the object was visible, it could have been almost anything: a piece of old equipment, the remains of a long-forgotten camp. No explanation accounted for why it was sitting in such a remote spot. To get an answer, they had to reach the part still buried. The team started clearing the ground around the exposed metal and quickly realized this wasn't going to be easy work. The top layer gave way slowly, and beneath it, the frozen ground grew denser. The object turned out to be far bigger than anyone had guessed in those first few minutes. The more earth the specialists removed,
the farther the metal surface kept extending sideways.
That's when ordinary curiosity turned into something closer to unease. What lay in front of the group wasn't a single plate or a stray scrap that had wandered into the tundra by accident. Buried underground was a large structure, and its full shape still couldn't be made out. The North seemed to be handing the find over piece by piece, refusing to let anyone understand what they were dealing with all at once. Who could have brought a structure like this out here? The answer might have been lying just a few dozen centimeters below them, but every new layer of frozen soil meant more slow, heavy work.
The group's situation was getting harder by the hour. The expedition's original program was still unfinished, and the approaching cold wouldn't let them spend forever on an unplanned discovery. Novikov had to choose between two risks: abandon the object and lose any chance of learning what it was, or keep digging and blow past the deadline set by his superiors. Neither choice was safe. There was no permit for separate archaeological or technical searches, and there was no heavy equipment for extracting something this large. All they had was what the team carried and their own hands. But stopping now, with part of a massive structure already exposed, wasn't an option either. If this object had industrial or state significance, leaving it unchecked would come back on them. The only way to find out was to keep digging. They dug for 2 full days. What had started as a quick look at a suspicious piece of metal turned into a grinding fight with frozen earth. The metal ran into the ground in several directions at once. This could no longer be a stray sheet of siding or an old barrel. Under the permafrost sat a whole, or once whole, object, and the deeper the team went, the more impressive its size became. On the first day, the group expected to finish before evening, but the ground beneath the top layer turned out to be so dense that every meter of progress cost hours, and they had to work carefully. A heavy blow could destroy the find or wreck details that might explain where it came from. They'd already sunk too much time and effort in to walk away without seeing the whole thing. Overnight, the temperature kept dropping. Ground left exposed during the day froze again by morning, and wind buried the cleared sections under drifting snow. Part of the previous day's work basically had to be redone. It wasn't just that the North was making the dig harder. It felt like it was actively trying to take back what people had started pulling out of it. On the second day, as if things weren't hard enough, the frost hit harder still. Right behind it came an early snowfall, quickly burying the ground, the tools, and every trace around the dig site. The work got even tougher, but stopping now would have been pointless. It felt like they were only a little way from a final answer, or at least that's how it felt to the people on the ground. The white blanket of snow changed the whole landscape. The dead grass disappeared, the uneven ground smoothed out, and the exposed section of dark metal looked even more ominous against it. There was nothing around to explain how it got there, only permafrost, snow, and a structure whose origin didn't fit any of their first assumptions. The early snow meant the expedition's main program might now be impossible to finish. The sites still waiting to be surveyed were disappearing under a white cover, and reaching individual points was getting harder by the hour. Every hour spent digging was now a direct threat to the outcome of the entire expedition. Novikov understood exactly what questions were waiting for him back home. Why had the group broken from the approved plan? He already had an answer for that. A strange metal structure buried in the tundra. But there was a second, far less comfortable question underneath it. Who had authorized spending 2 full days on that structure instead of finishing the geological work on time? Talk of a mysterious find might not sound like an excuse. It might sound like an admission that the expedition had been badly run. In the Soviet system, paperwork mattered as much as the work itself. What leadership cared about were completed routes, collected samples, confirmed results. An unexpected find could only change the way lost time was judged in one scenario, if it turned out to genuinely matter. And right now, nobody knew what the group was actually pulling out of the frozen ground. So retreating had become more dangerous than pushing forward. Abandon the dig now, and 2 lost days would be impossible to explain convincingly. Finish the job, and there was at least a chance of handing leadership something real instead of a pile of guesses.
Work continued despite the frost and snow. Curved metal surfaces emerged, along with tears, crumpled edges, fragments that looked like parts of a complex mechanism. But the object's exact purpose still wasn't clear. The outlines seemed too large for ordinary machinery and too unusual for a fixed structure. It looked damaged, as though it had once survived a violent impact. By the end of the second day, the team had fallen almost completely off their original schedule. Continuing the assessment work at full scale after the snowfall was practically impossible. It was becoming clear the mission would likely have to be postponed until spring, and Novikov would have to explain the unfinished assignment. But the unidentified structure had to be finished. Maybe the find itself would soften how much trouble he was in. And that gamble paid off. 2 days of digging stopped looking like a pointless whim the moment recognizable shapes started emerging from the frozen ground. Curved metal surfaces, crushed sections, an elongated structure. Piece by piece, it all came together into a single picture. Novikov's group had found an airplane.
Yes, an airplane. Not a tractor, not part of a drilling rig, not the remains of a temporary camp. The half-destroyed machine lay deep in the permafrost, as though the Earth itself had tried to keep it hidden from people forever. Much of the fuselage was packed with soil, but the overall shape left no doubt about what it had once been. Picture Novikov's relief for a second. Now he could explain why the group had gone off route. An ordinary scrap of metal would have interested no one, but an airplane, found this far from any road, instantly turned a missed deadline into a matter of state importance.
That relief didn't last long. The moment the team tried to identify the model, a new problem appeared. No one present could recognize the aircraft from its shape or its surviving parts. It didn't match any common Soviet design familiar to specialists, even from photographs or technical materials. There were no legible markings on the fuselage, nothing that could identify a military unit, a factory, or a country of origin. If numbers or emblems had ever been there, time and damage had wiped them out completely. There was no surviving plate with a factory name or serial number. What lay in front of the geologist was a nameless machine, and no one had warned them it existed. For a crash of this scale, some trace should have survived somewhere. Flight route records, missing aircraft paperwork, reports of a missing crew, or at least stories from local people. But Novikov's group had absolutely nothing. The airplane seemed to have simply fallen out of history and landed inside the permafrost without a name or a past. The state of the wreck made it hard to answer even the simplest questions quickly. The outer skin had peeled away in places, exposing internal parts of the fuselage under a thick layer of rust. The cockpit had suffered the worst damage. The upper section was almost entirely gone, the glass was shattered, and the interior was packed with dirt and debris. The nose, the section specialists usually use to identify an aircraft type and its construction details, had been completely destroyed, as though the plane had hit the ground with enormous force. So the machine could have ended up here in a crash. But if it really had crashed, where was any record of the incident? Why had no one ever searched for it? And why did the crash site stay unknown until 1959? One wing was almost entirely missing, as though it had been torn off before the plane even hit the ground. The second wing survived better, but it was bent and torn along the edges.
No identifying marks remained on it either.
Novikov reported the find to the relevant authorities, handed over photographs of the excavated fuselage, and marked the discovery point on a map. This was no longer just a strange metal object found by geologists. It was an unidentified aircraft whose origin needed to be established officially. The closer people looked at the photographs, the less sense the find made. A special commission was dispatched to the dig site. The specialists who arrived ran straight into the same question that had already been tormenting the geologists. What kind of plane was this? If it was Soviet, there should have been records of its production and its disappearance. If it was foreign, an uglier question followed. How had it ended up this deep inside Soviet territory? Neither possibility could be ruled out without a full examination. The commission had to determine whether the plane had crashed right there or whether it had been moved to that spot later. But permafrost can destroy one material while preserving another at the same time, turning the usual signs of age into unreliable clues. Removing the wreck had to be done with extreme care. Any single piece could turn out to be the key to the whole machine's origin, and an improper extraction risked destroying evidence for good.
The work was complicated by the fact that the aircraft was never built to withstand this kind of move. It was being lifted not off an airfield, but out of an uneven, frozen pit. Any wrong angle could crack the fuselage apart. The team knew they wouldn't get a second object like this, which meant there was no room for a mistake.
Once lifted, the find was secured on a truck and driven to a laboratory. From here, the answers wouldn't come from geologists. They'd have to come from people who understood aircraft construction, metals, and industrial technology. At the laboratory, specialists had to do what the team in the field never could: pin down at least an approximate origin for the aircraft. First, they checked the most obvious theory, that it was Soviet. It could have been an experimental machine, an early prototype, or a forgotten design that never reached mass production. Soviet aviation had plenty of projects that existed in a single copy.
But even a secret aircraft doesn't build itself out of thin air. Behind it should stand a design bureau, a factory, blueprints, test records, and the suppliers who made individual parts. Every engine, every fastening, every way of joining metal leaves behind its own kind of technical fingerprint. And that fingerprint is exactly what specialists set out to find. A shape can be changed, a fuselage rebuilt, identifying marks removed. It's far harder to hide the origin of the materials themselves, the assembly technology, the internal architecture of the machine. A production tradition tends to give itself away even in the smallest details. For comparison, they examined known domestic aircraft from different periods: early models, pre-war designs, planes from the Great Patriotic War, and post-war machines. The logic was simple. Even an unusual prototype should share some traits with the technology available to the country at the time it was built. The expected match never showed up. Not one known Soviet aircraft displayed a structure anything like it.
The metal raised even more questions. Samples were taken from the fuselage and internal parts and compared against the materials used across Soviet aviation industry, and no full match turned up. This was already serious. An unusual shape could still be explained away as bold engineering, an unusual layout as an experimental design. But creating a distinct aviation alloy required a metallurgical base, production equipment, and an entire chain of testing. No single person, however talented, could have organized all of that alone in the middle of nowhere.
The Soviet origin of the find was gradually judged unlikely. A theory emerged that the plane had been built outside the USSR, but that ran into a contradiction of its own. How did a foreign aircraft end up deep inside northern Soviet territory without leaving behind a single document, a single report, or any known search history.
Soviet representatives reached out to the authorities of England, France, and the German Democratic Republic, an unusual move for 1959. That alone was a signal that Soviet expertise had genuinely hit a wall. Why else send a strange northern find to be evaluated on an international level? The reasoning was sound. Every major aviation power had its own engineering school, its own characteristic materials, its own way of laying out an aircraft. Even an experimental machine usually kept traces of the country that built it, and an experienced specialist sometimes needs to see only a few components to place a design's origin.
England was where the highest hopes rested. British aviation industry had come a long way, from early wooden aircraft to powerful mid-century combat planes, and the country still had engineers who knew even the rare pre-war projects by heart. If the find had British origins, its construction should have looked familiar to somebody, but the British side refused to take part in the investigation. The reasons were never made clear. Maybe the authorities didn't want to send a specialist to examine an unidentified object on Soviet territory. Or maybe what they'd been shown simply didn't strike them as convincing enough. Either way, the refusal proved nothing, and it didn't bring investigators any closer to an answer. Soviet specialists couldn't rule out a British origin just because Britain stayed silent, but there was nothing pointing to British manufacture either. The English theory was left hanging in the air, unresolved.
France agreed to send a specialist. French aviation had a rich history, so a confident conclusion was expected from the expert, someone who could compare the wreckage against early French aircraft, pre-war projects, lesser-known experimental designs. But the French specialist didn't recognize his own country's work in it. Nothing he examined let him name a factory, a design firm, or even a rough model. The airplane didn't fit into any known line of French aviation development. Another theory ended in nothing.
Next, a representative from the German Democratic Republic joined the review. The German angle seemed especially promising. German engineers had produced plenty of unusual machines that were ahead of their time, and during periods of major upheaval, projects surfaced that only a narrow circle of specialists ever knew about. Could the airplane from under Norilsk be a forgotten German experiment? But the East German representative was no help either. He couldn't connect the find to any known German design or technology. If this machine had been built somewhere in Europe, why didn't a single leading European engineering school recognize it?
The Japanese angle was checked separately. Soviet specialists knew Japanese aircraft from the war years well. Hiding a Japanese origin behind an unfamiliar fuselage shape wouldn't have been easy. Surviving parts were compared against known Japanese designs. No match that could point to a specific manufacturer or model turned up. The Japanese theory fell apart, just like the rest.
The investigation had arrived at an almost absurd result. A real airplane sat in front of the experts, and not one of the 5 countries checked would claim it. Not the Soviet Union, not England, not France, not Germany, not Japan. No factory, design bureau, or engineering school could be identified. The machine had become a technical orphan, a complex piece of engineering without documents, without a history, without a homeland.
An airplane isn't a simple cart that one craftsman could hammer together in a barn out of whatever materials were lying around. Building one requires calculations, blueprints, metalworking, part production, structural testing. Even a single experimental example usually leaves behind people, equipment, and paperwork. But no trace of any of that could be found. The unknown aircraft couldn't be linked to a single major manufacturer or a single recognized aircraft designer. That's when the theory of a lone, genius inventor appeared. Maybe an unknown engineer designed the plane from his own blueprints, built a single example, and for reasons of his own, never revealed the work. The idea had a romantic ring to it. One man, decades ahead of his time, lifting his creation into the sky
and vanishing along with it. But the pretty theory ran straight into inconvenient questions. Where did this man get his materials? What equipment did he use to shape large metal components? Who built the complex assemblies and helped put the fuselage together and get the machine ready to fly? Even a brilliant engineer couldn't personally replace a metallurgical plant, a production shop, and a test facility all at once.
The metal alloy pulled attention back in again.
The unusual shape of the fuselage could still be explained away as a bold engineering choice. But the origin of the material was a far more serious problem. Comparative analysis found no material like it anywhere in Soviet aviation industry. Checks abroad turned up no confident match either. And you're probably already sensing where this is heading.
An alloy suited to flight has to combine several qualities at once: enough strength, an acceptable weight, the ability to handle load. Materials like that don't come from randomly mixing a few metals together. They're developed, tested, and only then cleared for use. And behind every working formula stands an entire production system. So where was the system that produced the material for this mysterious airplane? Why hadn't it left behind any other aircraft, any other parts, any other industrial trace? If this alloy really worked this well for aviation, its use shouldn't have stopped at a single wrecked fuselage. But nothing like it ever turned up anywhere else.
Building something like this would have required an entire infrastructure that simply shouldn't have existed for that era. First, the metallurgical base capable of producing an alloy with these properties. Second, the manufacturing equipment needed to work that metal. Third, an engineering understanding of aerodynamics that, according to the official record, didn't exist yet. Fourth, a test site and an organizational structure capable of carrying a project from a blueprint to a flying machine. Investigators couldn't find a single one of those four conditions.
One other possibility was that the plane represented a failed experiment, deliberately destroyed along with all its documentation.
But then it's unclear why the aircraft wasn't dismantled and melted down instead of being left in a remote northern territory. It's even harder to explain the total absence of any trace of its creators. Even the most secret projects eventually reveal some technological relatives. This unknown machine had none. Every new stage of comparison pushed it further away from both Soviet and foreign designs. First went the possibility of naming a specific model. Then the possibility of naming a country. Then, doubt even crept over the era it was supposedly built in. The airplane increasingly looked like an object that had ended up in the wrong place and the wrong time.
What remained was an almost unbelievable picture.
Some unknown aircraft designer had apparently built his own machine from blueprints that matched no recognized aviation school, using a material whose origin no expert could explain. A unique, effectively personal alloy with no equivalent anywhere in the aviation industry.
Now let's talk about the age of the find, because this is where the strange investigation turned into a direct hit against the entire accepted history of aviation.
After studying the fuselage, the materials, and the surviving components, specialists tried to date the aircraft. What they got back sounded so unbelievable that the result was checked a second time.
According to the conclusion, the machine was built in the last decade of the 19th century, somewhere between 1890 and 1899. Back then, aviation as we understand it today simply didn't exist yet. Humanity was only just approaching the creation of a controlled, powered aircraft. The Wright brothers' officially recognized flight took place on December 17, 1903. Their aircraft stayed airborne for 12 seconds and covered about 37 meters. That moment is considered the start of the era of powered, controlled flight. If the dating on the Norilsk aircraft was correct,
It could have appeared several years earlier than that.
Underline this. We're not talking about a primitive glider, a kite, or an experimental wooden frame. What was found in the permafrost was a complex metal machine with a fuselage, a cockpit, and wings. Its builders clearly intended not just to get something into the air, but to control a fully functional aircraft. The gap between a machine like that and the very first aircraft in official history was enormous.
But the real shock wasn't even the possibility that it predated the Wright brothers. In its construction and apparent capabilities, the aircraft looked closer to great patriotic war-era aviation technology, solutions that wouldn't become standard for several more decades. Somehow, at the end of the 19th century, an unknown designer had used engineering solutions that wouldn't become familiar until the 1940s. Who could pull off a technological leap like that? Keep this contradiction in mind, because it stays with this story to the very end. Between the last decade of the 19th century and the early 1940s lay an entire epoch. Aviation crossed the whole distance from fragile experimental frames to fast combat aircraft during that time. Engines changed, materials changed, aerodynamic schemes changed, control systems changed. The unknown airplane seemed to have skipped every intermediate stage entirely.
The first instinct was to suspect a laboratory error. Metal exposed to permafrost, ground chemistry, and temperature swings for decades could easily look older on the surface than it actually was. But the researchers, according to this account, double-checked their results and didn't back down from the original conclusion. Dating metal is far harder than dating wood or organic remains. An alloy doesn't carry a calendar year stamped inside it. The conclusion needed a whole combination of signs: the condition of the materials, the manufacturing techniques used, the details of individual components, and the conditions of the object's time in the permafrost. No exact method was ever described, but the final verdict was categorical: late 19th century. They looked for the error. They didn't find one.
By this point, the investigation had run out of convenient explanations. The Soviet origin hadn't held up. No foreign specialist recognized their own country's work. The unusual alloy matched no known aviation material, and the estimated age was older than the official history of powered flight itself. You could imagine an unknown inventor who beat the Wright brothers by a few years. The history of technology does know cases like that, engineers whose projects never got recognized in their own lifetime. But this wasn't a case of a small head start. This required explaining a leap of several full decades. One person would have had to predict the entire future of aviation, invent the necessary materials, and build a flying machine without any visible help from industry.
If the official record is accurate, there simply wasn't a technological base for an aircraft like this at the end of the 19th century. There was no developed aviation manufacturing, no established standards, no accumulated experience operating powered aircraft. Even the basic principles of the future industry were still being argued over through dangerous trial and error. And yet, this unknown machine looked as though its builder already knew the answers to questions humanity hadn't even asked yet.
That leads to a conclusion that's hard to simply wave away. Either the accepted history of aviation is hiding a huge unknown chapter, or this examination ran into something that has no reasonable explanation at all. The aircraft appeared older than the official birth of powered flight, while simultaneously resembling technology from a much later time. Novikov's group had found something that, by every rule of logic, shouldn't have existed.
Different theories started to surface.
The most reasonable one pointed straight back to an error in the examination. If the plane's technical level matched machines from the 1940s, then that's when it was probably built, and everything else could be blamed on unusual storage conditions and the destructive effects of time. But that theory left another problem untouched. Even a 1940s aircraft should still have recognizable parts, a familiar alloy, a knowable country of origin. Its construction couldn't have appeared independent of the industry of its own era.
It should have been built at a factory, tested, registered, and handed over to military or civilian services, and no trace of any of that ever turned up. Every aircraft leaves behind physical evidence, blueprints, production logs, lists of manufactured units, accident records. Even a secret plane isn't built on a single order and sent into the air without dozens or hundreds of people involved. None of that evidence for this machine ever showed up anywhere.
A second theory concerned the location of the find itself. Maybe the aircraft ended up in the permafrost much later than investigators believed. Dumped in the tundra during some earlier expedition, then forgotten or deliberately hidden. But transporting a large, wrecked aircraft hundreds of kilometers would have required a serious operation in its own right. Why would anyone go to the trouble of hauling a broken plane into an empty region just to bury it? Why choose this exact spot, northeast of Norilsk? And how did the people involved in an operation like that manage to leave behind no documents, no witnesses, no visible trace at all?
The deliberate burial theory turned out to be just as strange as the original mystery.
Every rational explanation gave birth to a new contradiction. A dating error didn't explain the unusual construction. A secret project didn't explain the absence of any production trail. A foreign origin was never confirmed by any expert. And a deliberate burial would have required an operation of an enormous, unexplained scale.
Investigators went back to the question of age again and again. According to this account, they rechecked the possibility of a lab error several times over. The result never changed. The machine kept coming back to the last decade of the 19th century. That single date is what broke every familiar theory. If the aircraft was really built in the 1890s, it was impossibly far ahead of its time. If it was built in the 1940s, it couldn't have ended up in an earlier era. Two parts of the same examination contradicted each other, and supposedly, neither one could be convincingly disproven. It was a dead end with no reasonable answer inside it. This is the point where a serious investigation starts discussing ideas that would have sounded like science fiction just a little earlier.
Not because they'd been proven, but because every ordinary theory had already collapsed, one after another. Among the people involved, some reportedly started cautiously raising the possibility that the normal sequence of time itself had somehow been broken. Their names never made it into the record, but the idea survived.
According to this theory, the aircraft could have been built around the 1940s, then somehow ended up in the 1890s, where it crashed or was abandoned somewhere in the north. Decades passed, the fuselage gradually settled into the permafrost, and in 1959, Novikov's group stumbled onto it by accident. A sequence like that would explain both the machine's technical level and its impossible age at the same time. But accepting it meant accepting something almost unthinkable. An object that had crossed not only a huge distance, but also moved backward through time itself. Along with it, materials, technologies, and engineering solutions that didn't exist yet in that era would have traveled back too. What you'd be left with is an object from the future, physically present somewhere it had no business being.
Could this find have crossed into our reality from some parallel world instead?
After the idea of time travel, even that no longer sounded like the most extreme possibility left on the table. If the machine belonged to no known aviation school and matched no known technology of its supposed era, then maybe it was built somewhere history unfolded differently. somewhere aviation could have arrived much earlier. In a reality like that, unknown engineers could have beaten the Wright brothers by decades. Metallurgy could have taken a different path, and this unusual alloy could have simply been an ordinary material for aircraft there. The plane found under Norilsk wouldn't have been a technical miracle at all, just an unremarkable machine from a different civilization.
The only impossible part would be how it ended up in our world. But how could two realities have ever intersected? What could have pulled a flying machine out of its own space and dropped it over the empty Russian north? A random rupture, some unknown natural phenomenon, an experiment that ended in disaster? History has no answer to any of that. Notice this. Parallel worlds can't be used as a convenient explanation for just any unidentified object. A conclusion like that needs more than an unusual design and a disputed date. It needs proof that rules out error and hoax. And here, the story of the Northern find runs into one more mystery of its own. Where are the photographs Novikov handed over? Where is the Commission's official report, the lab results, the detailed breakdown of the metal's composition? If this object really had the power to rewrite the history of aviation, those documents should have been priceless.
Maybe the material was classified. An unidentified aircraft could easily have interested the military, engineers, and government officials. And in an era of superpower rivalry, information about an unexplained technology was unlikely to make it into the open press, especially when the specialists themselves didn't understand who built the machine or what it was capable of. Or maybe the truth is more mundane. Missing documents could just as easily mean the story picked up unverified details over the years. A real crash turning into a legend, an unidentified model turning into a machine from another era, an ordinary examination turning into a sensational date. The longer a story like this survives, the harder it gets to separate the original events from everything added on later.
What's left is a choice. Either this is the trail of a discovery that was carefully buried, or it's a northern legend built around a real or invented airplane. Both possibilities demand proof, and it's exactly the absence of that proof that keeps anyone from putting a final period on this story. What happened to the aircraft after the lab examination is also unknown. Was it handed over to aircraft designers, moved into a closed storage facility, or broken down into individual samples? Nikolai Novikov and his team were the first to see the metal fragment, spent 2 days freeing the machine from the permafrost, and passed the information on to the authorities. But their detailed accounts never made it into the record. The central paradox never goes away. In 1959, 200 kilometers northeast of Norilsk, an aircraft of unknown design was reportedly discovered. It was never recognized as Soviet, British, French, German, or Japanese, and its estimated age contradicted the official timeline of powered aviation itself. So what was buried in that permafrost? A secret project even its own creators forgot about? A machine built by an engineer who was decades ahead of his own era? An aircraft from the future, from a parallel world, or from a lost technological line that never made it into the textbooks? Maybe the answer really is simpler. A flawed examination, misunderstood information, or a skillfully built legend. But if everything happened exactly the way this story claims, humanity would have to accept the existence of a technology that appeared before its time. And that puts more than one date at risk. It puts an entire piece of accepted history on the line. Which version do you find most convincing? Write it in the comments. The trace of an unknown civilization? A classified aviation project? A mistake by the investigators? Or a machine that genuinely came from a different reality? Until documents, photographs, and the results of an independent examination surface, this aircraft will remain a find that, by all rights, shouldn't have existed. If you stayed with this video until this exact moment, it means the truth matters to you as much as it matters to us. Not the convenient version, the real one. This channel exists for people exactly like you. Like this video, subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation, and hit the bell. There are still plenty of finds out there that don't fit the official version of the past. See you soon.